Part One of Europe in the Middle of the 17th Century by Martin Philipson, from The History of All Nations, from Earliest Times, Volume 13, The Age of Louis XIV, translated under the supervision of John Henry Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr Mater. To its great loss, Germany had for 30 years been the center of the political and military activity of Europe. Seldom has a people been stricken with such a calamity as were the Germans through the ruinous war for religion. That the country not only survived, but gradually elevated itself from its wretched state, is a proof of its indestructible vitality and essential soundness. The numerical strength of the armies was not such as utterly to ruin, even by their long-continued presence, a country so rich as the Germany of the beginning of the 17th century. The actual armies did not average in number more than 30,000 to 40,000 men, but camp followers hung about the combatants, and they too had to be fed. At the end of the war, the United Imperial Bavarian Army comprised 40,000 soldiers who drew rations, and 140,000 camp followers who got nothing. All these had to live at the cost of the peaceful, industrious population. As the pay was much higher then than it is now in the German armies, it was invariably in arrears, and the soldiers had to resort to plundering to maintain themselves. When they had once entered on the path of violence, there was no means of checking them in their wild career. In their depredations they halted at nothing. Rank, sex, place were not sacred to them. Violence was done to churches, altars, and even to graves. Robbery, burning, torture, and murder were perpetrated from sheer delight therein, on friend and foe alike. From all over Germany, from Pomerania to Swabia, from East Friesland to Austria, arose, with terrible uniformity, the same wail of despair. Imperialists, Leaguists, Swedes, Hessians, Bavarians alike fell upon the peaceful homesteads, took all that was of worth to them, destroyed and devastated the rest, wantonly slaughtered the cattle, wasted the fields and orchards, tortured the inhabitants to extort from them a disclosure of their hidden valuables, outraged women, and dragged the most useful away with them and sold them like cattle. On their departure, they not seldom set fire to the villages and towns. Even the forests were burned down and the fish ponds drained, out of mere wantonness. When a place defended itself, all the inhabitants were ruthlessly murdered, except the few rich, from whom they sought to secure ransoms by the most fiendish tortures of all kinds. It was a favourite amusement of these monsters to impale helpless infants, dash them against walls, or roast them in stoves. In short, the soldiers' motto was, "Whoever owns anything is our foe." Nor were the leaders more forbearing than their men. Count Königsmarck, once a poor German page, carried off enough to Sweden to leave his family a yearly income of 130,000 thalers. Footnote: the thaler was a silver coin having an intrinsic value of 72 cents, but it must be remembered that the purchasing power of money was 3 times as great at the period of the 30 Years' War as at present. End of footnote. To these devastations by the soldiery and the heavy taxes imposed for the maintenance of the troops, there were added the exorbitant war contributions levied by the generals from hostile towns and districts. In one small section of Hanover, Tilly, within 3 years, exacted 2 million thalers. In one single year, the little town of Goslar had to contribute 544,000 thalers. Brandenburg was laid under contribution by Wallenstein and Montecuccoli to the amount of 20 million thalers, and so on through a long list. The distress was universal. Business and exchange of every kind were further harmed by the debasement of the coinage, which was practiced by all the German princes, especially in the years 1621 to 1623, Brunswick having set the example. In place of standard metal, the coins were composed of copper or simply of sheet iron, lightly silvered over. No one would accept them at their normal value, and the uncertainty and confusion became so great that dealers and innkeepers took down their signs. So-called money was in abundance, but no one could get anything like its face value for it. A good thaler sold for 8, 15, and at last 20 thalers of the debased coinage. A bushel of corn brought 40 thalers of such money, a pitcher of wine 130. At last the taxes were paid in the debased money, and the gain slipped through the fingers of the princes. Then they remedied matters by calling in the new coinage at its real worth, and issuing coins of full value. But they had defrauded their poor subjects to the extent of the difference in value between the debased and the genuine money, and had done irretrievable injury to business. All industries were at standstill, even the busy hands of the husbandman was at rest. Whole villages died out, multitudes concealed themselves in forests, caves and ravines. Hunger gnawed the vitals of the people, who in their anguish ate human flesh, and even broke into graves, ascended the gallows and robbed the wheel to prey on the corpses there. Men fought over horseflesh and slew one another. More terrible still, men slaughtered human beings, especially defenseless children, that they might devour them. These horrors are not fables, but facts reported by eyewitnesses hundreds of times. In consequence of famine and unwholesome food, typhus fever and other contagious diseases broke out and carried off what the sword had spared. During the siege of Augsburg by the Imperialists in 1634, 60,000 citizens and country people who had taken refuge within the walls died. In Munich alone, then a town of only moderate size, 15,000 people perished within a year. The fever penetrated the remotest districts and most secluded mountain valleys. On all roads were to be seen pest chapels, erected to deliver the land from the terrible scourge. It was at this time that the natives of Oberammergau in Upper Bavaria, with the same object, instituted the Passion Play. No wonder that the result was an enormous decrease in the population in all parts of Germany, the effects of which continue to this day. It has been estimated that the population of the Empire in 1648 was only a third of what it was in 1618. In Brandenburg, by 1630, many cities were so nearly desolate that half of the houses were uninhabited, and the severest devastations were yet to come. Berlin, which suffered comparatively little from the war, numbered at its close not more than 300 burghers. In Saxony, the wolves multiplied to such an extent that they entered the villages and even the smaller towns in bands. In Dresden, the entire suburbs were torn down or burned. The city itself contained only the 15th part of its former population. In Thuringia, whole districts lay in ashes. The younger men had been drafted off to the war, in which most of them had perished, while the older people had either fled or succumbed to pestilence and the hardships of the war. In the county of Henneberg, for example, the population had sunk from 61,000 to 16,000, and even at the present day many towns have not recovered the population which they had in 1618. In Nassau, the villages dwindled away to a few houses and were often entirely deserted. In Wiesbaden, the marketplace and many streets were overgrown with thorns and brush, so that hares and partridges bred among them. Other streets had disappeared entirely and become merged in the forest. In Franconia, the depopulation was so great that every man was allowed to take 2 wives, and no man under 60 could enter a monastery. In Württemberg, 312 clergymen died in 1 year, and at Christmas 1635 over 100 churches were without priests. Many other cases could be cited to illustrate the universal desolation at the end of 30 Years' War. A contemporaneous work, Extidium Germaniae, depicts the condition of the country as follows: "One may travel 40 miles without seeing man or beast, except that in a village here and there you find an old man and a child or 2 old women. In all the villages the houses are filled with the stench of carcasses, men, wife, children, servants, horses, swine, cows and oxen lying intermingled, slain by pest and hunger, and gnawed at by wolves, dogs and carrion crows, because there is no one left to bury them." How had the German cities, formerly the main seats of German culture, degenerated? though since the time of the Reformation they had lost much of their earlier political importance through the continually increasing power of the territorial princes, they had remained comfortable and industrious, and at the beginning of the war were the seats of a pleasant social life. Their edifices rose stately and strong within their tower-crowned walls, their streets were well paved, and their water supply and drainage carefully provided for. They were still, in 1618, the guardians of German civilization, but the cities were both morally and materially injured by the debasement of the coinage, even at the beginning of the war. Then the armies began to roll past them, putting a stop to business and industry. Next, these demanded admission within the walls, and quarters, maintenance and contributions, the soldiers perpetrating all possible excesses. Finally came the storming and capture of numerous cities, which all but annihilated them for a time. Pestilence and hunger did their fatal work. Nor did the three imperial cities fare better than the provincial towns. The Hanseatic League also came to an end, King Christian IV annulling its last privileges in Denmark and Norway. In 1628 it held its last diet, only to announce the breaking up of the ancient union with the humiliating declaration that, quote, "the northern kings are the rulers appointed by God over the seas washing the German coast." End quote. Three cities, Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck, which still continued the name of the Hansa, maintained a carrying trade on a small scale, but even of this the lion's share fell to the foreigners, the traffic being chiefly carried on in English and Dutch ships. Instead of exporting wares, the ships left the harbours of Germany in ballast, and each year 50 or 60 millions of thalers went in this way over the sea, never to be seen again. Individual princes, after the restoration of peace, sought to better the economical condition of their lands, but they did this in accordance with the false views of the mercantile system then prevailing, that is, with one-sided patronage and artificial promotion of the weaker industries to the prejudice of that great branch which was then by far the most natural and the most profitable for Germany, namely agriculture. The national welfare was checked by unwise restrictions on intercourse and traffic in the interior. Navigation on the rivers was burdened by endless tolls, and was thus rendered impossible for remote distances. Every one of the innumerable little German principalities was hemmed in by almost prohibitive import and export duties. These exactions and impediments to interstate commerce worked all the more harmfully because the Empire, split up into so many petty principalities, could not, as against the foreigner, carry out a united commercial policy, nor indeed afford its inhabitants any effective protection against foreign corporations and private merchants. The infinite variety of money, too, and the want of a strict statutory supervision of the various mints threw further obstacles in the way. The consequence was that foreign products had everywhere the advantage over the native. The state of the rural districts was even worse than that of the cities. In spite of all restrictions and obligations, the peasants, before the outbreak of the war, were, especially in West and South Germany, in a condition of material prosperity and comfort. Their houses, though simple in construction, were well provided with furniture and conveniences. They possessed many cattle, and horse breeding was carried on a more extensive scale than at present. The sheep yielded a fine, universally prized wool, which, when converted into cloths, formed a favourite article of export. The culture of the vine, too, was then common in many districts where it is no longer followed. But after 1618 all this changed. The peasant was first defrauded by the debasement of the currency, then came the burdensome taxes for war purposes, and finally the armies, as previously described, devastated and desolated everywhere. How, after the return of peace, were the wretched conditions to be even mitigated? The peasants' dwellings were in ruins, their cattle slaughtered or driven off, their orchards cut down, their furniture destroyed, their money gone. Many discharged soldiers did indeed again lay hold of the axe and plough, but they were often possessed by the wild, unruly spirit engendered by war, and could not easily reconcile themselves to humdrum everyday village life. With the purpose of taming these turbulent elements, the greater landowners the social relations of the peasants became more and more oppressive. The peasant vegetated, penned in like his cattle, kept in awe by his parson through the dread of hellfire, regularly shorn by his landlord and sovereign, or led off to the battlefield in his own or a foreign country. Nor did the landowners lie on beds of roses. They lived on their impoverished and wasted possessions, for the most part crashed down by debts and lawsuits. Loans by which to repair the ravages of war were difficult to obtain, and then only at exorbitant interest. Many nobles had to leave home and court and attach themselves as satellites to their more fortunate brethren. Terrible as was Germany's material suffering from the cruel war, the intellectual and moral degeneracy was still worse. Pecuniary losses would have been made good with time had the people's spiritual nature been left uncorrupted. But this was not so, and even at the present day the wounds that the 30 Years' War inflicted on German character are scarcely healed. A turbulent, gross, lawless temper, averse to work of any kind, took possession of all classes in the Empire. The life of a highwayman or a vagrant beggar was more congenial to many than the hard constraints of honest labour. In Bavaria and many other places, gypsies, swindlers, and vagabonds of all sorts swarmed in bands over the country. If the Elector determined to go on a pilgrimage, he had first, for his own safety, to send out scouring parties to clear the roads. Since no one was sure of the future, the rule was to make the most of the present. How could noble conceptions, refinement of manners, regard for what is sacred, and a taste for higher enjoyments develop in a period of such vicissitude and barbarism? Nor did the wild manner of living disappear immediately after 1648. The misery of the times, says one, instead of bettering the people, made them worse. Profligacy, impunity, and kindred vices became daily more rampant, and all efforts to check them were in vain. This is most clearly proved by the frequent and repeated ordinances against the desecration of Sunday and Saints' days, dancing, drunken carousals, night brawls and clamour, cursing, fornication and adultery, excessive marriages and feasts, etc. How universally did superstition and fanaticism gain the upper hand, while young and old showed the greatest indifference to religion. Such was the condition of Germany at the close of the 30 Years' War. The prevalent degeneracy was aggravated by the fact that the clergy suffered more than almost any other class in the war. Of the ministers of an alien faith, the soldiers fell with a special fury, and care for the souls of the sick carried off numbers during the pestilence. The devastation of many universities, combined with the poverty of most congregations, checked the supply of new candidates. Education, too, suffered scarcely less severely. How wretched the condition of the teachers was is shown by ordinances issued in more places than one, interdicting the clergy from employing schoolmasters too often in their domestic service, as in sowing wood and threshing wheat. A seemingly paradoxical phenomenon of the times was boundless extravagance in dress and ornaments, and gluttonous excess in eating and drinking. Innumerable sumptuary laws show the prevalence of the evil, though they appear to have been without effect. In Leipzig, the maid-servants were summoned before the city council for wearing trains and laces, forbidden to people of their class, and the egos were torn from them. But such attempts to prevent extravagance were unsuccessful. People thought it better to squander what they possessed in luxury and riotous living than to let it fall into the hands of those who spared nothing. Even the priesthood shared this feeling and promoted it by encouraging lavish display on high festivals. The higher classes set an example of prodigality and frivolity which found ready imitation among those beneath them. The workman's ancient pride in honest work vanished. The decadence of German manufactures, which had been wrongly ascribed to the modern system of economical freedom, took its origin in the 30 Years' War. The coarse scepticism and the struggle after merely material interests, characteristic of the epoch, were perfectly compatible with the densest superstition. The terrors amid which everyone lived beclouded the moral nature of even the best disposed, and delivered them over to the gloomy frenzy of delusion. Soldiers believed that they could fortify themselves by charms against the enemy's weapons. A whole literature gathered round this "black art," which was, however, recognised as coming from the devil, and as ultimately fatal to those who practised it. In no other age and country did the belief in witchcraft prevail so generally as in Germany at this time. As if the sword, fire, famine, and pestilence had not claimed victims enough, innumerable persons, especially women, fell victims to the popular delusion about witchcraft. The witch commissioners gained renown in proportion to the number of unfortunates whom they caused to be seized and burned. In every village a committee was appointed to bring new delinquents to trial. In 3 years, from 1627 to 1629, the Bishop of Würzburg caused 900 witches to be executed. Nor are we to believe that all these victims were convicted through confessions forced from them by torture. Probably the darkest feature in the whole matter was that many regarded themselves as actually guilty. The horrors of the time and the universal belief in this direful superstition produced hallucinations that convinced many women, young as well as old, that they really had dealings with the evil one and had attended the witches' Sabbath. Even the Swedes, who came to Germany untainted by this superstition, became infected by the delusion and returned to kindle the fires of torture in their own land. It was only natural that the protracted civil war should destroy the last relics of national feeling still lingering in the hearts of the German people. These men who, with the help of foreigners, had for 30 years been slaughtering one another, no longer had a common fatherland. Was it possible for the Protestants to honour, as their emperor and liege lord, that puppet of the Jesuits in Vienna, who was the cause of so much of their sufferings? Even the Catholics saw that these Habsburgs cared only for the power of their house, and not at all for the welfare or greatness of Germany. The feeling of national unity and loyalty for a national emperor was dead. Catholicism was popular, at most, only in Bavaria and some of the ecclesiastical principalities. On the other hand, the meanness, cowardice and selfishness of the Protestant princes took from their fellow Protestants all confidence in them or pride in their cause. Ultimately, the religious character of the war was thrust into the background, and the contest became entirely one of political selfishness. How could any feeling of nationality or even of local patriotism arise? Little could Germany do to withstand the influence of the foreign soldiers and foreign officers, with their male and female hangers-on, who during the whole course of the war overflowed the land. The German does not have that hard, reserved nature which enables other nationalities to resist the effects of the introduction of foreign elements. Even in the Middle Ages the German nation had opened itself especially to French influences. How much more easy for such to find admission, now that all national life, all community of feeling, all pride in country, were dead among the Germans. The manner of the foreigners was so confident and imposing, and they appeared so much gayer, richer, and happier, that the poor Germans readily believed that everything was better which came from them, and eagerly imitated them in their manners, speech, and fashions. The special assumption of French modes dates from 1626. Men then began to make themselves ridiculous by imitating the giant perukes of the French court. The beard that the beau up to this time had cultivated and cared for with extraordinary anxiety was now shaved off. The monster peruke hung like a cloud over the beardless face. In like manner, the war mantle gave way to the overcoat, while the derby gradually shrank up into the vest. Naturally, the modifications in the female attire were not behind those in the male, the most noticeable being the very low cut of the dresses, so as to expose the neck and bust. Unfortunately, this spirit of mimicry prevailed not only in regards to the foreigner, but also in the relations between the different ranks. Everyone cringed before his superiors, who lorded more arrogantly over his inferiors. The princes themselves saw in their subjects only flocks to be shorn to the uttermost, as if in contempt of the reputation of being good housefathers, so much coveted by their ancestors, they gave themselves up to revels and extravagances of all kinds. At the same time they endeavoured to appear as mighty monarchs, surrounding themselves with armies, made up perhaps only of a few parade soldiers, with regular force composed of a host of ministers, privy councillors, and diplomats.